So every colonial country has an unhealthy obsession with its military, and Australia is no exception to this. In fact, Australia is probably the poster child of this. The Australian military is venerated in Australian culture. You could even argue that Australian culture is built around the military, and this isn't a mistake. This is a direct consequence of settler colonial history and settler colonial, culture. And the reason for this is because Australia doesn't have any other history. Like, we are founded in a violent invasion, we are founded in genocide and massacres and all these things that the new Australian state, the colonies that Britain are creating, that's not something you're proud of, even if you really believe in the white supremacist, colonial nonsense. You still are never going to be proud of committing genocide and massacres. I mean, otherwise, look at what's happening in Israel to Palestine right now. This is not a reputation anyone wants to have. So, almost off the bat, Australian military, or at least, military people in Australia, because at this point it's basically British soldiers and British Marines, they want to whitewash this reputation of being, baby killers and massacrers and everything. And so military institutions are created to create a kind of honour, because I guess when they're a result of an empire, well, that's what colonialism is, it's about building your empire, your troops are the core of that, and you want to make sure that everyone loves them. It's really part of the propaganda and about making your state official. Again, the IDF does exactly the same thing. And Australia hits this very unique point that it's kind of coming of age, because, you get the landings of the first fleet in like 1789-ish, and then there's like no history until Federation and World War One. That's not a coincidence. When you commit massacres to create a country, you have to hide the evidence, and that's what they did. They literally burnt a lot of the records. But Australia got very lucky in the fact that World War One kind of happens, and the Boer War, of course. These wars start happening around the time of Australia's federation, and they, of course, enthusiastically send troops off. And the first real big engagement, which is, of course, at Gallipoli, the invasion of Gallipoli and the Dardanelles in 1915, is a disaster. But it kind of creates this mythology around it. Because it's a disaster, they blow it up into this big, this was our coming of age moment. The moment we became one of the big boys. We've suffered losses and we've bled for our country and all of that. And that becomes a real venerated core part of Australian identity. And then, of course, it goes on to the Western Front, where it also becomes, awfully horrific. The Somme and Ypres and everywhere else after that. And, of course, we had one of our generals, John Monash, who was one of the real innovators that helped overcome the trench warfare. And all of this ended up being, Australia kind of comes like the shock army of the British Empire, us and Canada. And because of this, it starts in this horrible, gut-churning defeat, and it kind of ends in a victory. And this becomes something that Australia can grab onto, because, again, colonial culture doesn't really have any history it can build culture from, because the history gets erased because covering up genocides, right? And so this now becomes the bottom floor of Australian culture, and it only keeps growing because for that whole 20th century, it's just nothing but war for Australia. We are used as the colonial shock troops for Britain initially, but then by the time the 1950s are coming and the British Empire is collapsing, we get adopted by the Americans and we become their shock troops. And that's why we end up in the Korean War, we end up in the Vietnam War, and we have generally high success. Like, our soldiers do tend to perform very well, and that ends up becoming a really hard part of our culture. And it's interesting, though, if you want to talk about why Australian soldiers are so good, which objectively they are, people like to think it's part of our spirit or it's part of our, our culture and all that. But what I really think it is just the fact that we are a high GDP country with a small population, which simply means we're able to invest more into each soldier's training and each soldier's supplies and all of that. So we basically unintentionally create special forces as our normal army. And that's why we are sought after as shock troops. But I guess one of the real things I want to talk about, and this is kind of a follow-up to yesterday's video, in that we have this belief that we fight for freedom and democracy, and we have never, ever done that. Our army is absolutely colonial oppressors. They have been since day one. I think the first place Australian troops start fighting is like Sudan, the Battle of Alderman. And then we go on, of course, in the Boer War. We are used all over the place as oppressive troops for the British Empire. And hell, I'm just jumping around timelines here, but one of the big ones that we really never talk about is this thing called the Malay emergency in 1950, which is after World War II and after the idea of self-determination is really big deal in all the colonial countries around the world, especially in France and Britain. All these countries want their independence, and that was something that was kind of promised to them during World War II for fighting back against Germany, for fighting back against Japan and all of that. And then once the war ends and all the colonial powers like France and Britain come and just retake their colonies, they find that the people don't want to be taken back over. They really believe in this self-determination. And one of the big fights that breaks out is in Malaysia, where a lot of Malay independence fighters and a lot of communists just want to have their own country. And the troops they send to put this down are Australians. And that's like a direct act of oppression on part of the British Empire and Australia, and we rarely talk about that, do we? That doesn't make it into the Anzac talks and Anzac ceremonies. And that's, I really want to get over this idea that we are the good guys, because we're really not. And this isn't an insult to individual Australian soldiers. I know that everyone who joins the military does so with the absolute best intentions. And everyone, generally grows up believing all this propaganda. I did. I believed all this stuff growing up. And it's only when I really started to dig beneath the surface, I was like, hang on, this isn't right. And the more you dig, the more kind of horrible it gets. So I don't have any, beef with any individual soldiers. And I know that a lot of them are very brave and a lot of them are really doing their best. And they genuinely think they're fighting for their country. And I'm not going to take anything away from them for that. But I think we do need to talk about this pervasive culture we have where we venerate the military as being the defenders of democracy, and we've never done any such thing. And I think that's really kind of hitting a crisis point now. And I think the reason I want to talk about this so much now is the fact that we have this unapologetic and devout and ironclad support for Israel. Now, we're not quite doing what America's doing, but as Australia is a puppet state of America, we have to toe the line and we have to back up whoever they back up. And we are absolutely 1000% on the wrong side of history here. Like, Israel is an absolutely horrific genocidal colonial state that has no legitimacy of any kind. It's just a bunch of European settlers stealing land. And we're pretending still that all of this is just. Like, this is the end point of having this kind of propaganda put on us for decades, believing we're fighting for freedom and democracy. We clearly are not. And I know it's kind of a hard lesson to take to heart, and it's a hard thing to confront, but it's true. Like, we need to start questioning this culture. And I think that if we really want to, grow up as a nation, if we really want to have any culture grow here that goes beyond just military veneration and football and like these bland Australia Day barbecues that don't have any deeper meaning, the only way we ever grow culture in this country is by confronting the truth. And our truth is dark, and it is genocidal, and it's bloody, and there's a whole lot of bad stuff there we buried. But I guess to continue this metaphor, we need to dig it up, and we need to give a proper burial to our past, and we need to have proper reconciliation to actually have any kind of viable future. And this is something that colonial states don't understand, especially Israel. You can't just destroy the land, destroy the people, take it over, put up your condos and pretend that nothing happened, because those ghosts aren't going to leave, and the place is haunted until there is actual genuine reconciliation and reparations for the things that happen. That's what the whole land back movement is about. If you don't know much about that, you should look it up, and I'm going to make a video on it later. But yeah, I mean, this veneration of the military it's gotten to the point where it's obscene, and I just want us to acknowledge that. Anyway, that's my thoughts, and I guess it's something to think about.